are. This is a four-part series. We're in part two, week two, where we're kind of looking at the theme, the church without walls. Is leadership necessary? And we, this is kind of in a prelude to our practice gathering, which is going to be happening in Chicago on September 28th through the 30th, where we're going to have practitioners from all around the country that will be sharing with us lessons they've learned on the ground in their neighborhoods and their cities, and just a fresh way of being the church and awakening us to possibilities of being a grassroots movement. And so actually, if you sign up now for the practice gathering, you can get the early bird special. So you just have to go to thepracticegathering.org or .com, and you can kind of get all the information that you need there. Well, with that said, I want to kind of give an introduction to some of our panelists. I'm going to be hosting today. We kind of, in this four-part series, each of us will get a little bit of a chance to host. But let me kind of let you know about Jessie Cruickshank joining us there with the red hair. She's got her master's degree from Harvard in neurology. She's a mountain climber, a neuroecclesiologist. You'll have to ask her more about that in your questions. Who happens to be belligerently optimistic, recklessly obedient, patiently relentless, and constantly catalyzing change. She's a movement leader here with V3. She has a new book that's just released called Ordinary Discipleship, where she helps us discover how God has wired our brains for the adventure of transformation. So check that out. Next, we have, I'm going to say Eun Strawser, because I never pronounced her first name. I've had years of knowing her, never get the first name right. She's a co-vocational leader at Maki'alo, a church that's multiplying missional communities in the beautiful land of Honolulu, Hawaii. Not only is she lead pastor, but she's a physician, wife of Steve, who's an encouraging redheaded husband, mother of three amazing children who all joined the family on mission. I would say, she serves as a movement leader with V3 and is one of the most hospitable people that you probably have met. She's, as a prophetic apostle, she has the energy of 5 people. She also recently released a book entitled Centering Discipleship. And as someone who has the opportunity to spend a year with her and her community there, I can say she is living out the things that she writes about. So check that out. And then we have Mr. Dan White Jr., who is a deep thinker, a patient practitioner, and a prolific writer. Not only does he have numerous books out there, including Love Over Fear and the one that we wrote together, The Church's Movement, but you'll find him on Twitter and Facebook, writing very provocative things all the time. He's been a movement leader with V3 since the beginning, and recently he and his wife Tanya founded the Caneo Center in Puerto Rico, where we got at least one person from, which is a place of renewal for weary and wounded leaders. And as church planners and pastors, they're very deeply acquainted with the challenges that ministry brings. And so along with their retreat center where you can find rest and refreshment, you can also participate in a groundbreaking cohort, which is accessible, economical, deeply spiritual, and therapeutically informed journey to help ministry leaders gain their joy again. And my name is J.R. Woodward. I've planted churches on the East and West Coast. I'm a writer, adjunct professor, and I help to lead the V3 movement, where we train church planners, marketplace planners, as well as remissioning existing churches. I love to surf, travel, meet new people. And my most recently released book this past month is called The Scandal of Leadership, Unmasking the Powers of Domination in the Church. It's based on my PhD research at the University of Manchester in UK. And I hope that you can pick that up. So with all of those introductions, let's get to our first question today. To each of the panelists, this is the only prepared thing. Everything else is kind of spontaneous. But the first question is leadership necessary? And who would like to address this first? Oh, by the way, as they're kind of deciding who can address it, be sure to, along the way, if you have questions that come to your mind, there is a Q&A. Just post them in the Q&A, because that's the place I'm going to look for the questions not the webinar chat. All right.
All right. So I totally think there should have been like walk-up music or something for the background of each one of those intros. Those were amazing, JR. The evangelist gift is showing up today. Well, so since my other colleagues did the nod it nose touch before I was able to, I'll jump in the fray and then they will say much more amazing things than I do. But I don't know if leadership is necessary, but I think it's inevitable. And so leadership either happens intentionally or accidentally. And when you are accidental, that's when, weird things can happen in that space. But I think more than whether or not leadership's necessary, I think followership is necessary. So for me, leadership starts with followership. Leadership starts with, I would define leadership as being intentional with your influence. So if who the leader in the room is the person influencing the room, then stepping into that in a known and intentional way is what I coach people to in leadership. And so for me, then that starts with followership, that I'm following the Holy Spirit and I'm following the other people in the room. I have to be for them before I lead them. I have to love them before I lead them. And so to the degree that we have leadership that starts with control and command, and it's not about followership, but it's about doing to people instead of with people, then that we end up with toxic leadership and toxic environments. And to the degree that we think that the leader has in their own mind, like this power differential, this I'm different than you, I'm better than you, I have something that you don't have, and that makes me more worthy. And to the degree that we layer in status, which is like crazy, guys, right? We're crazy about status. The degree we layer in status, and we use status as a sign of leadership and the markings of leadership and the goal of leadership, then we end up in toxic places. But if we take on the posture of Jesus, the posture in Philippians 2, and we start with followership, we start with emptying ourselves, kaneo, dynamic, right? Then we can use our influence in an intentional way that's life-giving, that's emptying, that's serving to one another. So I think leadership is inevitable, but what type of leadership we have depends on the heart and the intentionality. And just that to kind of end that, to me, leadership is always a fruit of our heart and our paradigm of God. We always lead in a way that we think God leads us. So if there's an error in our leadership, there's an error in our paradigm with God. And so the way that we become a better leader, a less toxic leader, is through that deep, abiding, deep spiritual work. So I would prefer we didn't have toxic leadership and we had more just flat, but something will fill that vacuum.
Can you dig it down a little bit on that last thing you said there was our paradigm of how God leads us? Tell me about that. What is that?
So having done leadership coaching for a few decades, when I have experientially unpacked when somebody led poorly, when they made a bad decision, when they led in a way that was harmful to another person or even harmful to themselves, right? Because we can lean too far into the self-deprecation dynamic as well. When that happened and we walked that back, what it always came back to was this idea that God wanted something from them that was unhealthy or toxic, or that God himself was angry and controlling and dominating. And so I'm going to lead like that because that's how God leads. Like it always unrolled and peeled back to some sort of error in their understanding of who God was and what God wanted from them. So whether it was a miscalculation of responsibility, like everyone tells me that I'm accountable for this, but I'm like, actually, let's look at scripture. Not true. You're not accountable for that, but you are accountable for this. How are you doing there? So yeah, for me, anytime I see error and toxic nature in leadership, I always, as a disciple maker, would ask the question, well, I wonder where that's coming from. Because if we can fix that upstream, I bet they're going to lead in a better way.
That's good. And we're going to have more time to discuss these. I want to make sure we get Dan and Eun give your kind of first thoughts on, is leadership necessary? And then we'll get back into a little bit of a dialogue. So Dan, do you want to go since you're kind of popping some questions already?
Sure. Is leadership necessary? I think the question has some automatic assumptions, some expectations that we're talking about one person in charge of the room or in charge of the group or responsible for the audience or the organization. There is a just assumed reality that when we're talking about leadership, we're talking about one person. So that it makes that question hard because you have to deconstruct that leadership one person leading the group who has more wisdom, who has more personality, who has more training, who has more skill, who has more hours, is that the way that leadership is supposed to be constructed? I would say that in my journey, I would have believed that for the first quarter, maybe half of my ministry leadership, was that I was working really hard at becoming the best solo leader that I could be. Because I felt accountable, as Jessica shared, or responsible for being the one person that had all the wisdom and had all the ideas and had all the skill. So flipping that paradigm or maybe deconstructing it, pulling apart is I'd rather ask the question, is a leading community necessary? Is team leadership necessary? Is mutual polycentric leadership necessary? Yes. I think many of the problems that we're seeing in toxic leadership or even burnout is related to an unrealistic and undoable burden of carrying the mantle, if you will. So what we need is a better model of mutuality, shared polycentrism, interdependence, collaborative ways of being and doing together. We don't have a lot of models to imitate when it comes to that. Most of the people, if you ask anybody what's inspired them, often it's a solo leader. We celebrate really, magnificent and dynamic solo leaders, and then we learn our own leadership by imitating them. You don't often hear people say that they are imitating a leading community or that they are inspired by a group of people who share power in very gentle, kind, and servant ways. That's really unusual. And it's because we don't see that model put forth, and it's hard for us to get a window into that model. So my answer is yes. Is leadership necessary? But it would be that it's a gathering of leaders, a mutual gathering of leaders, rather than one person who has all the answers, has all the skill, is holding the microphone, blah, 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 blah.
That's great. Yeah, thanks, Dan. And Eun, for you?
Yeah, I was, thank you for giving us some time to prep this, since it's the one and only question I was able to prep. I kind of thought of it as like, why is this question even being asked, right? And all of you here, joining us in this webinar, you're joining or you signed up for this because this question was either interesting or poignant or hits hard at something in your own personal or experience, your communal experience, right? And so I kind of thought about it in two ways. Like, one, there is a shifting, emerging culture that obviously in a postmodern world is very and deeply suspicious of authority. So the question is really asking, is the way in which authority is being used or experienced today necessary? And then the second thing I thought about was, what is the motivation for leadership that hits at this question, if leadership is necessary at all? So the first thing is, we're seeing this in most Western culture, but we're actually seeing this in like the Middle East, Myanmar, China, with rising human rights activism, right? Those are probably the most clearest ways of confronting if leadership is necessary. But I think that it's actually posing a question about differentiating between governance and leadership. So if you're broadly speaking, governance are traditions and institutions by which an authority is given, by which authority is given to an organization, group, or a church, right? And if we're saying, is leadership necessary? Are we really saying in the church, are we leaning more away from supposed dictatorship, a form of governance, right? That says solo leadership, right? And are we moving more towards anarchy? I don't think we're saying the church should be moving towards anarchist tendencies, right? The second piece of that we're talking about is, therefore, if governance are the traditions and institutions that tell us how authority is established, then second, leadership is simply the act of exercising that authority. So maybe two things that we're in that question we're trying to re-examine or reassess is that re-examine and reassess the governance of a given organization or church. Are the traditions and institutions that constitute who has authority and what that authority is oriented around? Is it effective and meaningfully moving towards the flourishing of the community around us? And then second, can we re-examine and reassess if the manner by which that leader is exercising that authority, is that effective and meaningfully moving towards the flourishing of the community around us? And then secondly, for that question, is leadership necessary? I think it's really questioning, is the motivation for leadership in the church, has it changed from the first century church to now the 21st century church? And I think one of the best ways to examine how leadership and maybe the motivation for leadership has changed from comparing those two time differences is we kind of look at what the congregants or church members or Christians, how they behaved, right? If the first century church, and we've seen it throughout all the Old Testament letters, right? We know that it was a shared leadership. It was intentional and not just by happenstance. It often happened and was organized organically. They were deeply dependent on not just the Holy Spirit, but actually deeply dependent on one another. And so when we look at, since the pandemic just happened and I happen to be in healthcare. If we look at how it responds to the pandemic as Christians, if we compare to first century Christians in 165 AD, 251 AD in Rome, right? Rodney Stark writes in The Rise of Christianity that basically it was a life and the city was described as disease, misery, and fear. But what happened in that era was all the Christians stayed. Whereas everybody else fled the city, all the Christians stayed and moved into mission together and stayed with the most vulnerable and dying population. And all of a sudden, an entire governing power and world looked at the behavior of what Christians did at that time. And that's what put Christianity on the map for probably the first time from a government or world or national viewpoint. If you kind of look at what is the behavior of church and congregants today in the 21st century, we like to do church shopping, and most of the time, Christianity Today did a survey, and most people, when they are church shopping or church hopping, they ask, they want answers to what's most comfortable, what's most agreeable to them, and what's most entertaining, right? They say, unfortunately, the underlying forces driving some churches are the basic tenets of individualistic consumerism, born out of an assumption that church is primarily a product package of goods and services designed and marketed to achieve customer satisfaction. So if that is the driving force of what maybe churches ought to be like, then it kind of questions like, what would leadership actually be motivated by? It probably won't be motivated by, will we be the people who stay in the time of a pandemic with them in a city that's full of fear and misery and disease to be with the most vulnerable? It's going to probably motivate leaders to have to answer to, am I entertaining? Do I provide a comfortable space for people? And am I being agreeable to the congregation at hand? Okay, that's my time, JR.
All right. Yeah. Thank you guys for your introductory remarks. So the way we're going to kind of flow from here is we're going to have a little dialogue for the next 20 minutes and 25 minutes. And I'll kind of pepper with a couple questions here and there I want to get in, but feel free to dialogue, you guys. And then we're going to have a time, at least 15 minutes at the end for your questions. I already have some of them. And actually, I'm going to start off with what one of you guys asked because it was my questions as well. And I think you kind of answered them in some ways in your introductory thing, but I want you to kind of focus it a little bit on how would you define leadership? Again, I feel like you guys gave nuances of that, but just kind of give a quick definition, and then I have a little bit deeper question to start us off on.
Yeah, so for me, it's that intentionally stepping into your influence in the room. It's not necessarily associated with title or position, because sometimes those people are not the strongest leaders in the room. But it is about the atmosphere and the presence that you bring.
Cool. Eun or Dan?
Yeah, I think about it, um, Dan brought it up about mutual leadership and polycentric leadership. So for us in our local community, leadership, you kind of can tease it out to three different parts. And leadership in the church was what I'm going to camp on.
Yep.
So most of the time in the room, there is somebody or a group of people who maybe have spiritual or scriptural authority, depending on what denomination or spiritual background you're from. They have a relational authority. It's the people who know about all the other people, or they can shift a room by them staying or leaving, right? And it's the people who have decision making or quote unquote leadership for the organization. Sometimes it's a mix of all three in one group or one person, and so just knowing that that's the dance of leadership, because human beings being collected together, that's how people in the church kind of run. So for us in our local context, we look at leadership as people who aren't mainly doing things, but they're the ones who are trying to replicate the gift that they are able to contribute, but they exercise that gift by leading and raising up other people who can do it with them. So it's not the person who is the best speaker or the best teacher or the best gatherer or the most hospitable person. We're looking for the people who are actually replicating and duplicating that in other people. And that's how we start looking at, that person is probably rising in a gift of leadership for the sake of the community.
That's great. Dan?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have anything totally new to add, but I think that leadership is awakening, helping to awaken, whether that's from a group of people or one-to-one, but awakening to God's activity within them and God's activity around them and God's activity through them. So I think a lot of Jesus's leadership was invitation to have eyes to see and ears to hear. So it's less directive and coercive and more invitational and curious. So that's the way I would see leadership.
Cool. All right. I want to kind of start us off and again, like, feel free to kind of, after we kind of discuss this element, to move on to different things, ask each other questions. But, this past week, the Southern Baptists kind of met together, all of their messengers from around the country. And basically, the largest Protestant denomination in the U.S. confirmed with the Executive Council to be in unfriendly cooperation with Saddleback Church, one of the largest churches in the country, as well as a number of other churches. And the reason they basically, quote, kicked them out is because of their view of women in leadership. And in fact, what's interesting is, like, one of the churches that was kicked out, the woman had been a leader in SBC in her church for 30 years. So the question I kind of think about is, like, what changed in the last 30 years? That local church or the denomination and their approach. But what are your thoughts about women leaders in the church? We kind of talked a little bit about what that is, but I think in particular, they're probably talking about some obviously formal aspect of leadership, usually pastor. What's your thoughts on that?
I'm the dude in the group, so I'll go last.
Oh, I was kicked out of a Baptist church when I was 15. My whole family, we were. And in part, it was because I had a call to ministry on my life, and I knew that since I was 5 years old. And it was an independent Baptist church. It wasn't, part of the SBC, but we had a pastor at the time that I was a small child who was just supportive, and helped me, led me to the Lord, baptized me, etc., and felt that support. When I was a teenager, we had a pastor come in whose wife always wore a skirt, walked 3 steps behind him, and had a very different paradigm of life. And he was the one who told me that God could not have called me to ministry because God didn't do that. And that started a journey for me where I was questioning the goodness of God, the kindness of God, my ability to hear God, whether or not he'd made me the right gender. Not like it is today. I say that, and it was slightly different then. I was just like, how did my gender and my calling didn't go together? Then God made me wrong. And when I say that our error in leadership comes to an error in our understanding of God, I would say this isn't a polity conversation because they're violating their own polity of Baptist, and we all know that. But it comes down to that they sincerely believe that God made women as second-class citizens. They sincerely believe that God oppresses women, and therefore they oppress women. If they believed in the equal imago Dei, they wouldn't be behaving like this. And so whether or not that you want to put that in a different, call that complementarian, I don't want to do that because I know people who are complementarian who don't believe that women are, they don't oppress women because they don't believe that God sets up the oppression of women. So I don't want to put labels on it, but just that nuance that you behave as a leader the way that you think God behaves. And you can see this in the way that they've justified and said their posts are like, well, God says this, well, God does this. And having been on the receiving end of that for decades, it definitely created in my heart a suspicion towards God. And it took me a long time to believe that he was good and he didn't create me incorrectly. And now that I have that freedom, I want that freedom for every person, no matter what your calling is and however he made you. He did that on purpose, and he's not, the call of God is without repentance. He doesn't change his mind. He doesn't think he made a mistake. And so I want that for every person. So for me, leadership isn't an archetype. It's a calling. And however he made you, he did it on purpose. And I think that he says it's good. So I have to agree with that. And I'm going to champion that.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jessie. I kind of reflected on this, and when the news came out, and everyone who's involved in Baptist church world, we all knew this was going to come, right? This is it's coming to a head, and so prior to the convention happening, I just had several different conversations with women pastors in Baptist church context. And, prior to this, there were really, really painful things that ensued prior to it, right? Public mass emails about, identifying people and even if they had led like years ago in a certain position or role, just, it just was like very overdone and accusatory and really, really painful. So when I see all of that, that is a prime example of how a person is exercising a given authority, and individuals may think that it is a rightful thing to do, but then it makes me actually question, is the governance that allows leaders to do that to other people and other leaders, is that the thing that we ought to be examining or re-examining? And I think if there's one thing that the pandemic has not instigated, but exposed and accelerated, if we do not in any position of leadership examine and re-examine who is in leadership, why are they in leadership, who's missing, whose voices are missing from leadership today, then I don't think that we are going to do a good job of moving further into the future. I've been in settings where predominantly, Black and brown leaders, and when they have questions around a future of the church, and these are all leadership questions, right? All vision questions are leadership questions, right? Some of my Black brothers are saying that I don't know if I can even participate in that conversation because I don't know if there's a vision of a future church that includes people like me. So if that's the kind of setting that we're having these conversations, I think that how we think about a huge organization's decision about who gets to be in power or not, I think that every minority leader, every context where there are marginalized voices in leadership, everyone is paying attention to how and why these kinds of decisions are being made. So this is not just a woman or gender issue. Most of the time, women's rights are going to follow civil rights or vice versa. So for me, whenever these kinds of decisions come barreling down from top down, everybody in the minority world, we're paying attention to how and who are making these kinds of decisions. I grew up in the Korean Presbyterian Church. It means that all Korean Presbyterian churches here in the USA are like PCA churches, right? I never grew up with seeing anybody who's female in positions of pastoral leadership, right? I love the Presbyterian Church. I love the PCA Church. I love being Presbyterian. I love the rhythms and traditions around it. I loved all my leaders in it. And when I got married, we moved to a PCUSA church. And that was the first time that I saw a woman in leadership preaching from a pulpit. I never even knew that existed. And I'm not a dumb person, right? Ivy League degree, all these kinds of things, right? I just wasn't exposed to it. But I've also learned, I'm also not a dummy, because I've also learned, Jessie, to your point about putting terms around complementarianism or egalitarianism, right? I have also been in settings when an organization, flaunts themselves as egalitarian, but I do not see women in leadership in a shared way, or in a way that where men maybe are submitting to a female leader, right? All those kinds of things. So, I don't want to go into the avenue of which label are we. I want to know, how do your people, I can tell what your leadership is like by how your people see who is in power, how they are given power, how they even see themselves in power. When we started our church plant, that we have 50% women and men. And the women there, all of them experienced cultural and religious institutions where they were second-class citizens, always. They always thought that they were going to be the helps people. They were so fearful of being able to lead, that they always were going to take that second seat. And so before we launched, I took all the men out, and I told them, you see those women in that room? They're all probably could be planting churches in Hawaii and really be like a huge contribution to the renewal of what God's doing here. But unless they have your full support constantly throughout the way, they're never going to see themselves as leaders. So is there a way, just like as they have been able to practice the gift of submitting, mutual submission to one another, can you guys actually be able to do that too? And of course, it's all the men in our group. They go quarterly to go pray for the church, and especially all the women leaders, But like, if we're not doing that active work of addressing this as leaders, really contemplating and reassessing, actually, are all the voices at the table being represented? Do they actually have a voice that contributes not just to relational authority or spiritual authority, but also to decision-making authority? Then we probably have to do a longer work of reassessing things.
I have a quick question for you. Do you think that our global majority brothers and sisters are able to see this, and we're sounding the alarm earlier than, and maybe not as wooed by theological arguments, if you will, because it's really a power conversation, right? And they were able to see that maybe more clearly and more distinctly than those of us who might be of the same ethnicity. And like I said, we're wooed by the theology, like, oh no, they don't mean that, they intend. And so we couldn't discern the spiritual dynamic that was happening, as well as our global majority brothers and sisters.
Yeah, I think that culture, just like this, is probably a much more a conversation about culture than it is about theology, right? At the end of the day, I think culture has a lot more to do with how decisions are being made, right? I think that if you think about it culturally, a lot of context, women's rights is a global issue, because most women in most places are seen, governmentally, not just spiritually, as second-class citizens, right? It is a present issue. And so I think globally, depending on the culture, I think the majority will be like, oh, that feels like a good decision and a clear decision that people made, right? Most of the time when I'm in global settings with, coaching or consulting pastors who are brothers, in the beginning, they'll refer to me as sister. And then over the course of time, because they've experienced a form of leadership over their lives, right? That because of that personal experience, then they begin to address me as pastor, and it doesn't bother me, right? But I know that there is a cultural piece that we have to also really be able to name. And I think also, if you think about the global church, most of the contexts have come from white colonial visions and pictures of the church, right? If a white colonial picture of the church is what was initially established in a given global framework, right? In the majority of the cases, then it's going to be leadership is mimicking, right? Leadership is imitating, followership is imitating, right? You're just going to just assume that this is how it should be, unless it becomes everybody as a community begins to start addressing it. So.
Do I have time for a response, Gian?
Yeah, please.
So thanks, Eun. Thanks, Jess. I was conflicted over, Rick Warren's what happened there. So I'm going to introduce some tension a little bit. Is that, I'm excited about the acknowledgement that women are fully anointed and fully released to lead the people of God. The conflict for me is that the invitation to women, and at least in that paradigm, is to lead within the church industrial complex. And the way my metaphor is that when the big kid on the block, the SBC, says, "Hey, do you want to come to our party?" I don't think it's a healthy party to the way that power is used, the way that hierarchy is used, the way that the building of the church is through attraction. I think that we're kind of in a place where men have held power, and do we just need to add women into the mix of those power seats? I think the seat is broken itself. And I say this from experience. I've done quite a bit of care and coaching with women who have entered into senior pastor or lead pastor positions that men sat in before them, and the system hasn't changed, and it ate them alive. And so I think that I'm excited that Rick had that. I mean, I know he shared his own journey, which I thought was beautiful, and confessional, which was, kind of unheard of to be doing that in your late 60s after you built one of the largest churches in the U.S. But I just think we're not coming to terms with the way that hierarchy and leadership is functioned within the church industrial complex. I don't think anybody should sit in that seat. I think it is going to, I think it's a cancerous place. It ruins man and women as we sit in it. I don't think we can hold that much power, and I don't think we can hold power that way. And so I think that's why I'm conflicted with the invitation is to just be a senior pastor, lead pastor within the SBC. And the way that pastoral position is functioning, I think is healthy, is ruinous. I think we're going to see women burn out who enter into those positions, and the system hasn't changed, and it's not healthy for them as well. So I think we need to rethink about, what does it mean to invite women to the table? Right now, the table is the one that men built. And I don't think that's a good invitation from my perspective. So any thoughts on that, ladies, my friends?
I mean, a couple. I mean, one, I totally agree the seat is broken. I think that
Yes.
women are more, it's easier in some ways because of the cultural world that we've grown up in for women to build alliances and collaboration. women do flat better than men do in general, totally generalizing. And we can all think of, examples on why that's not true.
Sure.
But, I think it could actually, without changing, burn women out faster. So just some examples from being, 20 years in leadership myself. I never had anybody ask me how my family was doing. I never had anybody pay for a vacation or say, you know what, how's Bob doing? Are you guys having enough time together? The questions of self-care and family care that are asked to men on a regular basis. I've known hundreds of men who have had vacations paid for. I have been in the same chair, never had that. Never even had the question, never had the offer, never had the instinct. And so without thinking about the whole ecosystem slightly differently, I think it'll burn women out faster because they will do all the things. Nobody's taking care of them because there's an assumption that maybe they're taking care of their family already. I don't know what those assumptions are. But it is, when the seed is made for a man and all of the social expectations of a woman come with it, it ends up being a huge burden. So I think we can do leadership very well with who we're created to be and how we're created to think. But I agree with you that the chair and the table are broken. Eun, thoughts, sweetie?
Yeah. And I think, Dan, how you're saying that, maybe it's the church as industrial complex, right? That's what you're hitting on, that because churches run similarly to a corporation these days. Oh no, I said it, but it is, right? There's a CEO, right? And top down, right? Those kinds of things, right? Then you're kind of thinking about, okay, you can see a parallel that I think the business world has changed and progressed a little bit further down the line than church world has, right? But you can see a parallel of what kind of women pastors or women CEOs make it into those seats, right? It doesn't actually create a lot of space for both men and women who may not be a corporate style CEO type kind of person, right? Most of the time, I probably get into the seats that I'm in either business world or church world because of my personality. Right. My capacity is high, right. And all of a sudden leadership is based on, how much capacity, how much can you do, how much can you multitask and can you do a balanced life, right? People are looking at me. Can you be a wife? Can you be a mom? Can you be a business owner? And can you run the church? And if you can do that, okay, you've proven yourself. But the thing is, that is, if I'm supposed to be as a church leader, as a senior pastor ordained in my church, I'm supposed to live a life, as J.R. Woodward famously always says, and our church runs by it, is, do you live a life worth imitating? If I live like that, then most of my people will think that they cannot be true disciples of Jesus because they don't have the same kind of capacity or leadership style or those kinds of personalities, right? And I'm doing a disservice to my people because my life is not imitatable. So I think a thing about thinking about how do we dismantle a given seat today is, how do we make decisions? I don't care if you're in a complementary setting or an egalitarian. I want you to ask the question, who are you inviting to make decisions with you? What's the process of making decisions? Is it happening still in a very much corporate style behind the closed doors and everybody wants to sing that song, I want to be in the room when it happened, right? No. What if leadership is very inviting to ask proper questions, right? Because I know of my personal style and my tendencies, right? I have to dismantle even my own personality. So for me, if I know it's a big pivot decision that needs to be made in my church, it takes 6 months. We put it down as a leadership team that it takes 6 months to do a big pivot decision on purpose. And then we map out who are the people that we need to have conversations with? Who in the community do we have to have conversations with? What are the parts that we have to wrestle with so that we can help people transition with the loss that they're going to experience before just shouting out, this is all the gains that you're going to experience, right? Leadership matters who's at the table because of the process of decision-making and who is invited to make that process of decision-making with us.
Yeah, that's great. I really appreciate you guys, and we're kind of moving to some of the questions that people have. So again, if you're out there listening, please post your questions in the Q&A. I'm going to do a little bit of in the spirit of a question, kind of answer in the context that we've been talking. So, Dan talked about the seat itself is kind of cracked, or the table is messed up, and you guys have addressed that in good ways. And even in my work on the scandal of leadership, we talk about powers, and it really is actually the chair and the person, the system, all of that. And so the powers are kind of created good for a sense of order. They've kind of fallen, and not just the powers in government, but the powers in the church, if you will, but can be redeemed. Colossians 1:15-20 kind of talks about the redemption of both of it, invisible and visible realities. I guess I want to say that, and you have in the scripture, you have elders and qualifications. So you have these different types of formal leaders that are discussed and are in operation. And so what does it look like for those things to be redeemed? There are these elder chairs, there are these spaces that have some element of formality. So even that may, in this case, Eun, kind of know in your situation, that help discern how you make decisions as a church, right? There's somebody doing that I think in your case there. So what does it look like for those seats to kind of be redeemed? And how did Jesus in particular disrupt kind of the way the world thinks about and lives into leadership? Why don't we hear about that much, or at least see it much?
Jared, help me with the question. Is it? Can you bring it?
Yeah, like maybe just like Jesus. Maybe you could just say, how did Jesus kind of disrupt our approach to leadership? Because I think that's probably answers the redeeming aspect of things.
I'll take a little stab at it. I think that it's actually looking at the church when the church was formed, right? It's not necessarily looking at it in the 3 years of Jesus's ministry, right? You're thinking about what happened to a group of people, to humanity, in essence, right? Since the crucifixion and resurrection, right? What does the church look like in terms of leadership, right? So the first century church, if you kind of, everybody says like, oh, we want to be an Acts kind of church, right? Go back to being a first century church, eat bread, break bread together and pray daily together, right? All that stuff. Great. Awesome. Do that. But then kind of go and examine further about what the church was like, right? They were people who are all locally, communally based, right? Paul did not stay in one place for that long. Right. And there wasn't a main pastor that he is actually just talking to. It was a group of elders, most likely. And there are deacons, right? But that was the closest thing to some sort of structure that happened, right? Why? And most of the focus was not just on who has the most scriptural authority. Most of it was on who's being included into the table. It was Christian tables, if we're talking about tables, right? Christian literal tables where people had meals together. They broke class systems. They broke gender systems. They broke any sort of wealth, power systems, right? National or not national, Jewish, Gentile, right? They broke a lot of systems just at the table, eating a meal together on a regular basis, right? These were the places where all the conversations were being had, right? How worship was being done. It wasn't a solo male leader that Paul was just talking to. There are many, many females that he was writing about also, both male and female, in error and not in error, right? And that was just the life and the messiness of the first century church, right? But the things that I think about because of that in my own local context is not just about, is there a gender equality in the leadership? I think about, does the leadership actually represent fully who we are serving and who we're doing community with? I knew from the get-go, for me, I could not stay the main leader or the person who makes the most decisions all the time because I'm not from Hawaii. I'm a transplant from Philadelphia. I just opened my mouth and everybody knows I'm not from here. So I knew that a goal of a metric of success of how successful are we with our own leadership is that at every level of leadership in my missional community context, are there local people who have been born and raised here in Hawaii who have a stake in the game longer and bigger than me? Than anybody else? Are they represented and are they a part of making decisions? I think having a rule of thumb of not just gender, but like, does your leadership look like the neighborhood that you're serving? That's one of the first questions to ask.
That's great.
Yeah, I just want to throw in there that I really believe in the Jesus modeled incarnational leadership. He didn't just model like incarnation for the sake of salvation, but also for the sake of sanctification and that journey. And so, I was raised with servant leadership. I love servant leadership. I watched a few people go super weird about that and become like complete doormats. And they didn't, they like it got weird, right? Anything can get weird. So for me, incarnational leadership is where you go to that posture of a missionary leader that never turns into a colonizer. Like, never stop being a missionary, never stop raising people up and helping them and being there for their flourishing, because it gets weird as soon as we make it about us. And for me, that's how, that constant discipline of baptism, going low, empower and share it away. We're not meant to hold power, but we are meant to be a conduit. Holding power totally rewires our brain for narcissism and amorality, and it creates all kinds of problems. But we can be a conduit if we understand we're not the end, and the power of heaven can flow through us for the sake and for the empowerment of other people. So I think it's a discipline to go low, to disempower yourself, to take that posture of low power, to share it out, to be a missionary leader and an incarnational leader. But man, it's a lot of work. It's constant. It's discipline, and it's good.
All right.
And it's amazing.
Let me, and this kind of still in the same flow, but like someone says, when you say it's a table that men built, can you explain some more in light of how the table is built scripturally while being mindful of the biases within the existing church structure? Added to that, maybe, someone said, I'd like to hear more about the references to qualification of elder. So they kind of flow together. Dan, do you want to start off with that? Just like the table built by men, can you explain how it's to be built scripturally and being mindful of the biases that we have in the existing structure?
Sure. The bias part is probably a bit hard for me to answer, just because I do think there are some unique cultures in different denominations. So I get to coach 15, 16 different denominations a year, and there are some distinct walls and blockages in those spaces so one size fits all bias is a bit hard for me to kind of get at. Scripturally, though, let me answer. The fivefold ministry of Ephesians is, I think the church has given a lot of lip service to and has not oriented themselves around the apostle, prophet, shepherd, teacher, and evangelist sitting equally at the table. What we have right now is kind of a hierarchy of gifts, or the gifts that we feel more attracted to or seem like more people will rally around. So scripturally, I think we have to start with Ephesians 4. And what does it mean for the apostle, prophet, shepherd, teacher, and evangelist to submit one to another, to equally be heard? What does it mean for me to take off my prophet hat and put on my shepherd hat, learning from my brother who's a shepherd? I think meetings should be structured that way. I think that our maturity is through our personalities as a shepherd. I'm afraid of conflict. I can learn a lot from my prophet sister who's at the table of how she approaches conflict. So scripturally, I would say we need to start with the fivefold. Now, the problem is some people have seen the fivefold abused. Things get weird, things get funky, right, Jess? And so there's some allergy to the fivefold for people. And I know this is from talking about it quite a bit, but that the fivefold can be an instrument for awakening and releasing the whole people of God. This is why women need to be included. The fivefold wasn't just for men, it's for all of us. And so if we start there and we start to grow in our intelligence and discipleship and development and confession about where we're immature as a prophet or a shepherd or an apostle, I think our teams and our leadership will be a lot healthier.
Great. Well, we are unfortunately kind of near the end of our time. I did want to make a plug for a book that just recently come out called Tell Her Story, How Women Led, Taught, and Ministered in the Early Church by Nijay Gupta. It's a great book that kind of highlights not just like people like Deborah in the Hebrew scripture, but what was really happening in the context of the New Testament church. And often, just like NASA kind of hid these three Black women in what's that movie that came out?
Hidden Figures.
Hidden Figures. Yeah, we've kind of hidden a lot of what women do. I mean, you have Junia, who is a apostle, and you got women prophetesses, you got Priscilla and Aquila, and so he will go through all of those type of things, and also hit the passages that sometimes are used to basically like diminish the role of women in the church. And so, how do you understand 1 Timothy 2 and some other passages that are weaponized against women? How do we understand those properly, especially in light of how women were actually living in the church? So I would encourage that book. I think because of the nature of it and the SBC thing, it's actually the paperback is sold out on Amazon, but I'm sure it'll be replenished and the ebook is available. So it's a very, very good resource. I would encourage you. But I'm gonna leave the time with Dan. We got a couple minutes here to share a little bit.
Sure. Yeah.
Close us up.
Awesome. Great. Hey, this is fun. We're going to have another one in next month. We're going to be talking about, what are we talking about? Discipleship?
Yep.
Yeah.
Does discipleship work?
Does it work? So we're going to explore that. But what we do want to invite you to consider is joining a cohort. So all of us are part of the V3 movement. And for the last 10 years, we've trained over 600 women and men to start communities that are life-forming in discipleship, boundary-crossing mission, tight-knit community, and locally rooted presence. It's a beautiful tribe. It's a beautiful space to belong and to train. And right now, it's 10% off to join a cohort. Those applications you can apply right on the v3movement.org. And our cohort kicks up in early September, but we're taking applications now. And we all meet up together at the Praxis Gathering. And so it's a really fun and beautiful and life-giving space. So we really want to invite you to consider training in these ways of being the church without walls.
Well, awesome. Thank you, Dan, Eun, Jessie, for your thoughts today. And we look forward to see you guys next month as we talk about discipleship. Peace out.